Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens.
Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. First, we'll discuss the placement of European Commission top jobs as European leaders convened in a summit where Ursula von der Leyen seems likely to secure a second term as president of the Commission. Then we'll turn to a conversation with Marcus Roberts, Chief of Public Data at YouGov, to discuss the UK elections and broader trends in European politics. We hope you enjoy the show. Okay, Max, lots of movement in Brussels, some of it surprising, and we can talk about the policy aspect. Some of it not so much, which is more on the top jobs package.
We saw the white smoke, and it's now apparent that Ursula von der Leyen is set to be renominated to be European Commission president. That will be of great relief, I think, to many in Europe, but especially here in Washington. She has a really good relationship with the Biden administration. But also Kaja Kallas, the Estonian prime minister, has been selected to be HRVP, the High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy. And then Antonio Costa, the former Portuguese prime minister, will now be the European Council president, replacing Charles Michel. And this is what everyone expected last week. And the slight hiccup was Giorgia Meloni, of course, the prime minister of Italy, whose party performed well in the European parliamentary elections, and she was pointing to the fact that the far right had done better, particularly her European party ECR, and sort of annoyed that not one of these top jobs had gone to someone from ECR. Also, we should say Roberta Metsola will be renominated as head of the European Parliament. She's also from EPP, like Ursula von der Leyen. But Meloni sort of caused a stink. She came out of a meeting and looked very angry last week. And in the voting for these positions, Meloni notably abstained from supporting von der Leyen, and she voted against Kaja Kallas and Costa. However, it was sort of all sort of smiles and hugs, I think, from many of the European leaders when they came out of the European Council, at least it seemed, and that Meloni had sort of done what she has been doing vis-a-vis Europe, which is sort of dissenting on some things, but also sort of being a team player here. And I think abstaining on von der Leyen actually may help von der Leyen in solidifying, hopefully, her support at the European parliamentary level, because she has to get a majority of the votes. And that's going to be a big question about whether she can do that. Because maybe just one side note there, whoever thought it was a good idea to have a secret ballot for members of parliament to vote to approve the European Commission president, like, why? Why would you do that in a democracy, to not have elected leaders be transparent about who they're voting for? Like, what is that about? That seems really crazy to me.
Well, I don't really know why. I could imagine part of that decision was try to continue to make European institutions less aggressively partisan. So you're just giving members of parliament a pass on who they vote. I agree with you.
It's bonkers.
We're past it. Yeah. We're also past it because we keep talking about democratic deficit. And so at some point, members of parliament who, to be honest, already get a pass on a lot of other things, including an ethics body, for example, just could be asked to stand by their vote. That's really the next step. So Antonio Costa is fine. The European Council president just needs to be voted in by the European Council. Kallas and von der Leyen needs to be approved by the European Parliament. Von der Leyen will be first. That will happen in July. That's the vote counting that really needs to happen now. And we've seen over the last couple weeks, the liberal group, Renew, has actually lost seats. So some newer parties or existing parties that sent more members to the parliament decided against joining Renew, for example. We saw Volt in the Netherlands. They decided to stay with the Greens. The Czech ANO took out their own liberal MEPs away from Renew, although they weren't really liberals anymore. That's the party of Andrej Babiš. So, not a lot of love lost there. But that will be a vote counting exercise for sure. On the Italy side, it could go a couple ways. It might help von der Leyen to show that Meloni was, unhappy with her being picked. And so there's no clear alliance with ECR. I think that could also make Meloni a more acrimonious partner in future negotiations. So far, she had been able to say, look, I have really good relationships within the EU institutions with the top people. So it's okay for me to stay a cheerful friend and be positive about a lot of these decisions. But now it will serve me politically better to be more confrontational. Not quite like Viktor Orban, but you never know. So that's something to keep in mind. And I'll just say, clearly, Giorgia Meloni is no feminist, but at the same time, this decision was made by leaders of centrist parties, all of whom are men. So I can understand some of the frustration there too.
It did result, though, in 3 women and the first sort of person of color, because Costa is of Indian descent. And so, I produced a diverse outcome. I think with Meloni, I think some of this might be performative and positioning Italy to get another one of the kind of top positions just below these the executive vice presidents of the European Union.
From a realist perspective, Italy doesn't have that much leverage right now with the European Union. It needs a lot from Brussels, so it's also not like she can rock the boat that much.
And we're also looking at the far right kind of chaos on the European side about what parties they belong to. Maybe one quick thought about Kallas. I think this is a really significant step that she's going to be HRVP. Josep Borrell, I think, was a solid HRVP. He got a lot of criticism. It's a hard job to try to figure out what is EU foreign policy and try to create a consensus. And I think, Borrell, slightly older, early on, came from the kind of softer side of the house when it came to engaging with Russia, so lost some credibility with the East. But when we have someone like Kallas, who's now an internationally known figure, in part for how articulate she is when it comes to talking about the threat posed by Russia, I think this is a really important move, in part because it really elevates the profile. People in Washington in particular, and I think other capitals around the world, know who Kallas is and see her as a strong voice. I do think that there's going to be a bit of a transition for her. And I've seen this at the State Department with secretaries of state, Secretary John Kerry, for instance. It's hard for him to go from the Senate to then running a big agency. But Estonia is a country of 1.3 million people where it is focused on Russia. And so for Kallas, now she has to really deal with Africa policy, Latin America policy, Indo-Pacific, China. This is not just Russia. And also, Borrell had a big cast of people around him from Spain. Estonia is quite small. Does it have the experts on Africa? Perhaps. So I think she'll have to figure out how to be reliant on the EU External Action Service, on the building, so to speak, but then also find her own way. I could see the first few months, she'll start stepping in it a few times, and I think that's fine, but I think there'll be blowback, and then it's about how she kind of evolves in this role. And I think she'll be good, but I would expect that there'll be a lot of Western Europeans, they'll be quite nervous. And the first time she sort of steps out of line, quote unquote, and gets out in front of the EU consensus, or says something about a policy area where maybe she's, hasn't quite grasped it yet fully, that they'll be ready. Reporters will be focused on that. That's just something I think we're going to see over the next 6 months, or once she gets confirmed and is really in the job.
Those are really great points. I think she's a really smart woman. She can learn really quickly. Your point about personnel is a really important one. I don't think she'll find everything she needs from, no offense, the Estonian Foreign Service. So she'll really need to rely not just on EAS, but also potential advisors that were with Borrell, that were with von der Leyen, people that hopefully she can come to trust. But I also think her hearing, for when they vote her in, potentially in the parliament, will focus a lot on her fluency on other issues. At the same time, I don't remember the parliament grilling Borrell on Spain's position on Kosovo, for example, because it's still one of the few holdouts, or his focus on the Mediterranean and the South as a Spaniard. Or Thierry Breton's focus on being super French, or Commissioner Weyrle enlargement being a Hungarian who honestly has brought some of this bias to his position. So there's a level of fairness, I hope, that goes into how much they'll grill her and hopefully giving her grace and time to learn. But I think she can.
Oh, absolutely. And I didn't mean to suggest otherwise.
Oh, no, you didn't.
But I do think also there'll be more scrutiny now, in part because compared to 5 years ago, I think this role is seen as much more important than 5 years ago. And I think that's a testament to the kind of EU evolving. There's one last topic that I want to rant on a little bit. I'm looking at Etienne, and she's blurry-eyed. I'm blurry-eyed. We just watched last night the U.S. presidential debate, which shockingly was very focused on NATO and European security.
Europe's time to shine in the worst possible way.
Perhaps in a way that you don't really want to be center stage in a debate. NATO was mentioned way more than China was, for instance. So the debate was obviously not great for President Biden. Washington has exploded a buzz with talk of changes. What I would sort of want to talk about is that very day of that debate, the European Council met. And Olaf Scholz came out of the council meeting and told reporters that he strongly opposed Eurobonds. Now, any listener of this podcast knows that I have this strong, weird passion for Eurobonds. But the reason why is because for Europe to replace the United States or to fill the gap left by a Trump administration in Ukraine, they have to act right now. In fact, they probably needed to act 6 months ago. And the problem is that Thursday, June 27th, may go down in history as a disastrous day for Ukraine. Because if Joe Biden remains the candidate and doesn't win, Donald Trump made very clear that there really isn't going to be continued U.S. support for Ukraine. And then Olaf Scholz, on the same day, made clear that Germany and the EU is not going to use its financial capacity to actually support Ukraine and ramp up defense production. And so what this means is that if Biden's not president in January of 2025, U.S. aid is going to stop. And we're going to see the same problems for Ukraine that we saw over the last 6 months. Now, right now, no one's talking about how the Ukrainian forces might fall. There was a fear about the NATO summit coming up next week that, man, Ukraine might be on the back foot and this could be a disastrous summit because Ukraine, could be, on its heels. Now, Ukraine is still, fighting a really tough fight, but no one's talking about that because U.S. aid kicked in. The weapons are flowing, and the weapons are flowing because we have the weapons. Europe does not really have the weapons. And when Germany points to what it's doing on a national level, great. Well, then really, if you're looking at having a strategic effect, you need to triple that funding. And what I think the Germans don't realize, because they have a very myopic foreign policy that oftentimes looks 2 inches in front of their face, is that wars are funded through finance. World War I was funded, the Allied forces, by J.P. Morgan. World War II, Lend-Lease, was funded by the U.S. government providing loans to the U.K., which they only paid back in the Blair administration. So Europe either needs to ramp up and spend a lot more this year. Germany needs to effectively triple what it's spending on Ukraine because France isn't going to, because it has huge budget deficits, so it can't. Or you do the smart thing and you essentially borrow the money and you pay it intermittently over time so you don't have these huge budgetary hits. It's a clear path to ramping up defense production. And they're not doing it. They're not doing it. And so if Donald Trump wins, Europe will not have ramped up enough, and Ukraine will have a huge gap in its forces in 2025. And I think this was the week where we're going to really learn what the trend line was here, and it's not good for Ukraine.
And we're heading into a Hungarian rotating presidency of the EU. They're not going to be the ones trying to force a compromise on this.
Not only that, but it's also Mark Rutte's last European Council meeting before, or maybe not his last, I don't know when he will exactly transition out, but he's a lame duck. And so if there was a time to also get the Dutch on board, it was now. So a huge missed opportunity, in my view, at the EU level, and a huge problem potentially for Ukraine if Donald Trump is elected and Ukraine support dries up.
And at a time where there's absolutely no bandwidth in Washington to talk to European partners about this.
Well, let's now transition to our interview and talk about something, much more straightforward, which is European politics. The UK election is probably more straightforward, but we're also going to talk about the French election with Marcus Roberts and some of his takeaways from the European parliamentary elections. We are thrilled to welcome Marcus Roberts back to the Eurofile. Marcus Roberts is the Chief of Public Data at YouGov. He was previously a Director of International Projects at YouGov and has worked for the Labour Party in the UK, the Democratic Party in the US, as well as for several think tanks and campaigning groups across Europe and America. Marcus is the guy I go to try to get a beat on what is happening in politics around the world. Marcus, thanks so much for joining us.
Max Donetian, it is wonderful to be back with you. And I don't know about giving you a beat on what is happening, but there sure is a lot of stuff to talk about.
Yeah. When we originally scheduled this, it was like, okay, well, we'll, sort of preview the UK elections. The European elections will be sort of far in the rearview mirror. There will be sort of not much else happening. We'll really focus on the UK, but fortunately, there's a lot happening in European politics. And we'll start with the European elections that occurred earlier this month, then talk France, and then go UK. So Marcus, The narrative of the far right surging strikes me as slightly overstated, more of a France-Germany story. What are some of the big takeaways that maybe you had from this election? Where's European politics headed right now based off the European parliamentary elections?
Yeah, Max, I think we made the big mistake and brought this on ourselves last time of saying that it should be a relatively quiet summer and this would be a good moment to take stock electorally of where things stood. And that was, of course, what then provoked President Macron to decide to call emergency elections, Prime Minister Sunak to call emergency elections. Us all had to deal with the consequences of the European Parliament fallout. There's a lot. So let's get into it, starting with the European Parliament. And I do think that the commentariat have lost their perspective on these results. I think that broadly, the centre did hold in these elections, much as we forecasted in polling terms to do so. Yes, there were advances along the right. Yes, there were some setbacks on the Liberal side of the equation. But this was nowhere near the kind of 2016 disruption or rupture moment that many people were expecting these elections to produce. And what's important here is, yes, the results in France and Germany and the concerning results in terms of the Front National and the AfD there. But I think it's easy to overestimate the significance of that in what was fundamentally a low turnout but high political interest for the far right election. These were not national elections. Maybe we'll get onto that a bit with regard to Macron's gamble. But when I step back and I look at the structure of the European Parliament as a whole, I see a strong majority in that Parliament for the European model as it stands, and a lot of political force amongst the EPP and S&D groups, that is to say, to listeners not quite familiar with the alphabet soup of Brussels, as some of us unfortunately have had to be, with the main right wing and the main left wing, centre-right, centre-left groupings, which, though they've been bitten around the edges, remain the main players in that Parliament. Now, sure, there is a question of the far right's resurgence, especially in Germany and France, as we say. But once again, I would emphasize low turnout elections that are of high interest to nationalists should not be mistaken for being portents of general elections with much higher turnout, where the issue is not just let's send a message about how we feel on immigration to Brussels, but rather how do we feel about the economy or public services for the future of our country as a whole. And that's why I'd say that some of the commentary, I think, has been overdone on this matter.
It seems we did see sort of a backlash against the Greens as well. I posed this to a European Green member of Parliament last week and said, well, didn't you sort of get your agenda implemented? And so this is sort of the inevitable backlash that occurs. I got pushback saying that we didn't get our agenda fully implemented. And I'm like, well, of course, as an American, looking at the EU agenda, it seems like there's been, the focus of the last commission. You got your agenda, and now there's sort of an inevitable backlash. Is that how you see it, or are the issues at play here seemed a little bit of a pushback against the green agenda, migration, issues that play to the far right? Do you have any sort of policy takeaways here for, how these parties need to navigate going forward?
Well, before we get to policy, let's talk about the politics here. And I think that Greens everywhere need to learn to take yes for an answer. When Greens do well with policymaking, and the last European Parliament and European Commission cycle was a really good cycle for the green environmentalist agenda, I think they need to be proud of that and talk positively about their successes. One of the things that we know worries voters and pushes voters away from environmentalism is constant catastrophizing. And if you have a successful period in the Commission, if you have a successful period in the Parliament doing sensible, useful, important things to combat climate, and then you turn around at the end of 4 or 5 years to voters and say, everything is a disaster, the planet is burning, and there's nothing that we can hope for. You can't really be surprised when voters say, well, what's the point of voting for you anyway? Especially when you kind of did what you were saying you were going to do in the first place. So I think a little bit of pride, a little bit of success, a little bit of hope could really help the Greens go a long way in politics.
I feel like for the Greens, part of the challenge is also that they're not a new political force, but they're newer in the halls of power. In a lot of countries, too, in the last few years, as you said, after 2019, they entered governments, sometimes for the first time. And it takes a while to refine your message. They have a policy message that's clear and a goal. But I think turning that into the politics is something that they're struggling to do In some places, for example, in just my own experience in Belgium, they focused a lot on social issues, economic issues, which is fine, but that's where they get blurry with other parties. So I think they just haven't really refined their message very well. And as you point out, they focus a lot on the negative. So maybe a tweak in the message, instead of saying it's terrible, it's more, we've done all this, we want to do more. Especially at a time where on the EPP side, for example, we've seen some changes in the policies that they were pushing in maybe sanding the edges of something like the Green Deal around combustion engine, nature restoration, even though that ended up passing. But that leads me to my question to you on this, and maybe we can switch to France after that, is you talked about how the EPP and the SND are doing fine overall. The EPP has actually grown its number of seats a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit, and SND has lost some. I've been trying to put a framework around this. It feels to me like the EPP has managed this by moving a little bit more to the right, by sanding the edges of things like environmental policies, whereas the SND, a lot of the national parties that go into that group, stuck with their original line and haven't moved leftward the way the EPP has moved rightward. Is there something to that?
Yeah, Jennifer, I think that's a really, really smart take. The EPP knew what it had to do politically going into these elections, not just electorally. Whereas I sometimes think you might say that the Social Democrats cluster, the Party of European Socialists and the like, they went into these elections with an electoral game plan. We need to win these seats, and we will organize to win these seats, and we will organize these voters. But having an electoral plan is nowhere near as good as having a political plan, just as you pointed out in terms of the advantages of the EPP there. And one of the big, I think, lessons in the first instance, the Greens, and in the second instance, the centre-left more broadly, is for the Greens, you cannot save the environment on the backs of the poor. You can't tax poor people into a better planet. And environmentalists who have tried to do this have run into electoral problems with good reason. Just as for the right, it is a mistake to try to balance the books and the economy on the backs of the poor. So I would say for the environmentalists, it's a mistake to try to save the planet on the backs of the poor. Then for the centre-left, we're again back to that courage of your convictions. And if you're not going to talk about the successes of your record, you can't expect anyone else to. So the Social Democratic group in the European Parliament did have success stories to tell about workers' rights, did have success stories to tell about smart regulation of business, about how growth can be greener in the future, thanks to the decisions that the last Parliament and the Commission have made. They didn't tell that story. Instead, it was all electoral, all organizational, all of the time, and missing that political element with, sorry to be a broken record here, hope is a real setback for the left and for the Greens alike.
Yeah, it does seem that the center left kind of in the left sort of lack a vision for Europe right now. I don't quite know what they're trying to do at the European level. In some ways, they seem to all be running national elections on the center left. And while the EPP was talking about defense and other things, I didn't quite get any message from the center left and what it's trying to do in Europe. And you see long-term trend with SND gradually losing vote share. It's not huge, so they're still a huge player, but there's sort of a broader structural decline. Maybe you could comment on that, but I do want to ask you also about the far right and the right, and maybe it's worth trying to make a distinction between the two. Because ECR with Meloni did quite well. Meloni improved her vote share based off her national election about a year and a half ago. But then others on the far right didn't do quite as well, and now we see some divisions. How do you kind of see the far right landscape playing out? If you could comment on those, and then we'll go France.
There's a difference, once again, between an electoral strategy and a political strategy. The left has an electoral strategy, and the right has a political strategy, and the far right has a very effective political strategy in places like Italy, as we've seen. Now, one of the biggest differences between those two concepts is whether or not you think you can organize your way into an electoral victory, or whether you think you can persuade and galvanize your way. And when I think about Meloni and their success, it's a focus on what the voters care about, not what numbers of voters you need to turn out in which districts in order to hit which numbers. Now, that is a necessary part of politics, but it should sit beneath political strategy, not trying to subvert politics to the electoral outcome desired. When I think about that laser-like focus that Meloni has on voter interests, I think particularly about the cost of living. Don't think about the economy here so much. Meloni's been quite good at distinguishing between what is good for Italy's economy versus what is good for Italy's citizens in terms of their cost of living. And this makes it more personal, this makes it more real, and even when she's struggling to deliver a difference, it makes her appear like she's more on the side of the very voters that she's trying to hold on to. This might sound like very basic politics, but it's amazing how often politicians don't do basic politics. And that focus on things like the cost of living, I think, is rewarding her very well indeed. And if we touch on Spain, I think we'll understand that that's one of the reasons why Pedro Sanchez was able to do as well as he did indeed, because he remained aligned with the voter on the things that the voter cared about, as opposed to being seduced into thinking that you could somehow organize your way to victory.
I think that's a great segue into talking about the other surprise of the year electorally, which is France, of course. And speaking of the far right as well, we obviously saw that the National Rally, Marine Le Pen's party, did really well in the European elections, with the caveat that you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation around what happens at the European Parliament does not necessarily leave the European Parliament. However, we're seeing polling that shows that the National Rally is poised to do quite well in the legislative elections that will happen. We're recording this on the 26th of June, so it's happening just in a few days for the first round. I think it's also important to remind our listeners this is a 2-round election, so there's always an opportunity in the second round for whoever the other candidate is to rally the anti-far right vote. But what do you make of the polling that we're seeing now and what a lot of us, and I think a lot of commentators, have called, Macron's gamble in this election?
I have a lot of sympathy for the political predicament the Elysée found themselves in the wake of the European Parliament results. And they will have thought this is an extraordinary mandate for the politics that opposes us here in the Elysée. The margins in the Assemblée Nationale are extremely thin. Come the autumn, there's going to be a question over whether or not we can even pass a budget and whether there'll be a no confidence motion and the government will fall. And so in all of those instances, there is a logic to the gamble, which I do get. But unfortunately, not everyone in politics is born to be Pedro Sanchez. Not everyone in politics is born with the ability to call a snap election and be extremely good in executing that snap election by aligning with the voter, making that election about what you want it to be, and rallying the country in the face of the far right. Just ask Rishi Sunak how that very formula is going for him in the UK. And so whilst I understand why the Elysée made the gamble that it made, it is not looking good, as you said, Don Etienne, about the outcome of that gamble. It is looking, per the polling, like the far right and the Popular Front of the left will end up essentially in a state of stasis, of Cold War, between neither of them able to form a majority, neither of them able to form a government, even on a confidence and supply basis, let alone a coalition basis. And confidence and supply is a term we use in parliamentary bargaining around our government will survive on a vote-by-vote basis with some tacit support from other parties. So it's a question as to how indeed the Fifth Republic's government at all functions at this time. And that leads us to the next thing, which is, to what extent did Macron need to call this election at all? And here I was very shaped by my experience working in Democratic Party politics during the Bush years. And I remember in 2005, 2006, there was Bush Attorney General Alberto Gonzales, and he was found to be under investigation, if not outright guilty, I seem to recall, of any number of misdemeanors and errors and failures as Attorney General. And he simply refused to resign. He refused to resign, he refused to resign, he refused to resign. And no matter how bad the situation got, he simply refused to resign. And in the end, Slate.com had to retire its Gonzales Watch resign meter because they never saw him ever resigning. What's my point in this story? It's that if you've got guts in politics and you can tough out a situation, you can tough it out for a lot longer than people ever think. So the other option available to Macron and the Elysée was simply to say, yeah, the European Parliament election results were terrible. And yeah, it's going to be really awful in the budget in the autumn. And yeah, it might suck afterwards. But you know what sucks a lot more? The Front National winning an election. And so it depends upon your ability to suffer pain and to be able to suck that up, like Alberto Gonzales proved that he could. I'm not saying that's a particularly nice model of politics, but sometimes it's a brutal business, and remaining in government means continuing to stick with your plan, even in the face of things being very tough indeed.
Maybe I could ask you sort of a more structural question when it comes to this election. I mean, it strikes me that what Macron himself, like this is all his fault in part because he broke French politics when he created En Marche and he destroyed the center right and center left and occupied the center of French politics. And when you occupy the center, then where's the opposition going to come from? It's going to come from the far right or far left. And are we just sort of seeing the reversion to kind of a two-party system in a majoritarian political environment in which the big question is who moves to the center? Is it the left or the right? And whoever does that may win the next election in 2027. So are we kind of seeing a reversion back to a two-party system? It's just going to be messy?
I think that's one of the scenarios, Max. I also think another scenario is that French politics is about to be dominated by a three-block system, which will be very messy indeed. A block of the far right, a block of the far left leading the left, and a block of centrists. The block of centrists will be the smallest of all, and this will make for super messy parliamentary politics that probably lacks majorities, but even for an extremely confusing situation come the presidential elections, in which we'll be guessing all the way up till the results of the first round as to who the standard bearer against the far right will be and where that will come from. Not necessarily in terms of a trade-off between the center and the far left and the left, but rather amidst the left and the far left and who they could nominate, who could still appeal out to the center. But French politics is going to be extremely dynamic as a result. And so, if I may, I'll dodge a prediction here and just say, watch this space for just how fluid it's going to be.
And the left, as you point out, they're not close friends. They're current allies because of the circumstances, because they realize that's how they can get enough votes to get somebody in the door. But we also know that the personalities inside that coalition right now don't necessarily get along between Jean-Luc Mélenchon and Raphaël Glucksmann. There's not a lot of love-lust between the two. And there's also a lot of, I think, policy differences on some really important files. So that's definitely something to keep watching.
Very little desire to do trade-offs there.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
The left not compromising? Shocking.
Or not getting along? How surprising.
Well, maybe we could transition to what seems like the boringest election.
The other left that's doing well.
Yeah, there's been some drama, but we kind of, in some ways, know what's going to happen in the UK elections that are coming up on July 4th, or we think we know. It looks like Labour is going to come back, and the big question is how much do they thrash the Conservatives? Marcus, what's your kind of current read on the UK election? What are you watching for? Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, but what's your kind of take on the upcoming UK elections?
It's looking like a big win for Keir Starmer. It's looking like potentially a historic big win for Keir Starmer. He might even somehow end up with a majority as big as, or possibly even greater than that of Tony Blair, who achieved it in 1997. And what's really astonishing about that is Tony Blair was starting from a position of not at parity, but a lot closer to parity with the Conservatives in 97. Whereas Keir Starmer is starting from the worst position that the Labour Party has found itself in since 1935. Like, this is a very, very historically bad nadir as a starting point. And so it's extraordinary to imagine that this might happen. For this to win of that scale, Keir Starmer's Labour Party will be winning parliamentary seats that have literally never had a Labour MP in their entire existence. The American equivalent would be the Democrats sweeping Idaho and Wyoming. That's the kind of scale of political catastrophe that appears to be unfolding for the British Conservative Party at the moment. And the reason for that is probably three big factors. One, a breach of trust on the part of the Conservatives as a result of what we call Partygate. That was the drinking parties in Number 10 during lockdown, when other people were isolating. The Conservatives under Boris Johnson seemed to be having parties in Downing Street. That was also tied to a lack of trust over the Conservatives' failure to deliver on their promises to what they call level up, or improve the living standards and growth potential of different parts of the United Kingdom beyond the big cities. So there's a loss of trust. That's the first thing. The second big thing was the mini budget of the short-lived Prime Minister Liz Truss, which resulted in a lot of tax cuts overnight for very rich people and a lot of problems with the bond markets and a lot of problems with the strength of the sterling on the international currency markets. That resulted in her becoming one of the shortest-lived prime ministers by only just 45 days as a result. So that took the Conservatives' mantle of economic competence away from them and created a cost of living crisis that it was one of the defining factors of the election to this day. And the third and final point, maybe we'll talk about this next, is the emergence of Nigel Farage and the British form of hard right, or even almost far right politics, and his Reform Party, the latest version of the United Kingdom Independence or Brexit Party, that is really challenging the Conservative Party from the right. And imagine in American terms that the Republican Party split into two, a traditional conservative Bush-Reagan-like Republican Party and a MAGA Trump wing, and they both competed on the ballot. What you would see, of course, would be a split result. And against a split Republican Party, the Democrats you would expect to do very well indeed. And so you take it together, that loss of trust, that loss of control over the economy and the cost of living crisis that followed, and then the emergence of a split right, and you understand the contours that mean that there could be a very dramatic shift to the left with Labour in the United Kingdom on July 4th.
You mentioned Brexit, but just in sort of passing. It strikes me that are we seeing sort of the repudiation of the Boris Johnson trying to kind of alter the British electorate, sort of break the Labour dominance in the north and the so-called Red Wall, and that, you know, part of Brexit was sort of this populist play that then it seemed to really turn British politics on its head. And it seems like what has happened, particularly with Truss and Sunak, is that essentially the Tories have lost credibility both in the north, and so Labour has regained their support up in the north. Keir Starmer isn't really mentioning the Brexit vote, but then Brexit probably potentially costs the Tories credibility also in the south with sort of traditional conservative voters. Is that a right read, or how do you see Brexit playing into this election?
Well, one of the biggest factors Brexit has for this election is that I would argue that the single biggest explanatory factor of Brexit was the desire to take back control of the United Kingdom's borders, particularly with regards to immigration. The Leave campaign successfully campaigned on control of the borders, on an end to European Union's freedom of movement, and that this would bring immigration under control. And there were any number of lower income, lower education voters who felt that immigration had squeezed their standards of living, led to higher costs, and put pressure on public services as a result. These were not by any means, way, shape, or form racist voters. These were voters with legitimate economic and social concerns about the pace of change in their communities. And they thought that voting Leave would result in a change. And what they have seen instead is worse standards of living, a tougher time for public services, and no control whatsoever over immigration. Indeed, immigration has skyrocketed in the UK in the years since Brexit and now stands at a higher rate of migrants than it did pre-Brexit. And so on every single front of the Leave promise, those voters feel disappointed. Now you combine that with feeling let down over those lockdown parties, feeling let down over the broken promises to level up the whole country, and seeing that Keir Starmer leads a different kind of Labour Party, a Labour Party that has changed, a Labour Party that did kick out Jeremy Corbyn, has got rid of the stain of anti-Semitism and dangerous institutional racism that plagued the Labour Party for so many years, of a pro-Putinism that was extremely dangerous to the health of British politics and made even the Labour Party for a while a seeming national security threat. Now, these were grave concerns that the voters very wisely had, and they've seen Keir Starmer change that Labour Party. They've seen the Conservative Party let them down. They've seen the Reform Party challenging the Conservatives. And so they now have any number of options on the table that don't involve voting Conservative. And that disappointment over Brexit, as you rightly say, Max, is a huge shaping factor in all of this politics and all of this political economy that has led to this consequence and is leading, I think, to where we're headed on July 4th.
And to Max's point, I think about conservative voters who are losing their trust in the party they've voted for a long time. I think Brexit has also affected, for example, SME owners. Like when we see people trying to ship things to Europe when really it was the core source of their business before, these are people who would have voted Tories and today look at this and think, well, this is worse. This is so much worse for me. So I think this plays a role as well. But maybe to turn towards the election itself and what comes after. We've talked about the results are not exactly a surprise. It will really be about the margin of success for Labour. But in a lot of commentary, we see that it's really because people are unhappy about the government they have now. It's not that Sir Keir Starmer is necessarily the most charismatic leader Labour has ever seen. He's actually, I think, no offense, bland enough that people can say, okay, this is someone we can trust and we'll vote Labour. But this is this election. What comes after July 4th? And is this something that Labour can maintain? Or is this likely to be a temporary phase for the electorate that might actually turn back towards more discontent? Like, how much can Labour really do once it comes into government? How quickly can it come into government after the election? And what kind of change do you see as possible?
Really good points there to raise. Two big responses, one on Keir and one on the voters' expectations. And they're kind of tied together. On Keir, he's a reassuring character. He is fundamentally, and voters see this, an honourable man with a strong sense of integrity who tries to do the right thing. And he doesn't always set the heather alight as a Tony Blair or a Bill Clinton would. But at a time in which a lot of successful politicians of the centre-left are more like Jonas Støre, more like Olaf Scholz, more like Joe Biden, that reassurance is important. That reassurance after enormous, tumultuous chaos, you would even say, of recent Conservative years. How many prime ministers and how many years has the United Kingdom gone through? That reassurance can be quite settling. And that leads me to the voter expectation thing, which is voters are looking for change. And everyone in this election agrees that this is a big election about change. And they will be lending their votes in large number to the Labour Party. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that this vote is not given. It is not guaranteed to the Labour Party. It's not something that the Labour Party will own. It is lent to the Labour Party on the condition that it does some tough and important things, that it begins to knit the fabric of the country back together socially, that it begins to end some of the divisions in our politics that we've seen since Brexit, that it begins to get growth from all corners of the country again, rather than just saying we're reliant upon, financial services or the cities to be the sole generators of GDP. And then most potentially important and difficult of all, rebuilding trust. Now, that will take time, and that will require Keir Starmer to make promises only that he can keep, and then be able to return to the country for re-election and say, everything I told you I would do, I did do. And now I'm asking for you to have a little more faith in the way politics goes. But those are big, tall orders, because those are big national missions, as he characterizes them, about changing the country, changing the shape of our economy, as well as rebuilding trust in politics. I think voters are expecting those things, and I think they're lending their votes to Labour on that basis, but they will take those votes away if the Labour Party and Keir Starmer doesn't deliver. And that reassuring nature that he has is going to be more important than ever as he tries to tell people this won't happen overnight, it will take time, but if you stay the course with me and trust me to do it, your trust will be rewarded in a changed Britain. It's not going to be easy, but that's the challenge that's in front of him.
Marcus, we're over time, but last question. What is the future of the Conservative Party? It seems like it's going to be out in the wilderness, and we'll have to kind of choose between heading in kind of the far-right Trumpian populist direction, Nigel Farage, or back to kind of traditional conservative Tory. What do you think is their future?
The Conservative Party has a very easy route and very quick route back to power. What it has to do is put country first, as Keir Starmer would say, and stop putting its party or political or short-term interest ahead of the national interest. To do that, it would need to do such things as taking on Nigel Farage and opposing him, rather than trying to feed the tiger that is Nigel Farage in the hope that that tiger will eat you last, as Churchill would say. Spoilers, it doesn't. It always just eats you. It would need to turn the page on Liz Truss's failed premiership and the damage that she did to the economy. And it would have to turn the page on Boris Johnson and the trust that he broke with the Downing Street parties. The Conservative Party, I don't think, is going to do any of that. It's going to try instead to have its cake and eat it too. That's what Boris Johnson likes to say. As a result, it will try to accommodate all of these different wings, all of these different tribes, and continue to put its political and short-term interests ahead of the country until it has the guts, the courage, and the strength to have some internal fights to say who is not in their tribe as well as who is. I don't think it's coming back. Now, it will come back, obviously, but the longer it takes to do that, the longer Labour's period in office probably will be. So, as I say, it could come back very quickly if it had the strength to take on Farage and take on its own demons. But I see no sign so far that it wants to do that, and every sign so far that it wants to continue to feed the tiger.
Marcus, thank you for the tour de horizon across European politics. But Marcus, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you.
An absolute pleasure to see you, Donatian. An absolute pleasure to see you, Max. Thanks so much. Looking forward to seeing you in DC soon.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Please also check out a recent report by me and the CSIS Japan chair, Chris Johnstone, examining Europe's security role in the Indo-Pacific. The report asks the crucial question, what does the United States actually want from Europe in the Indo-Pacific militarily? And we provide the answers in that report. I'm not going to give you a preview. Go download the report. Our thanks to our producer, Sean Falk, and to Otto Svensson for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.